everybody. I'm Gerald Jones, Vice President of the Center for Racial Harmony in Belleville, Illinois. Welcome to the second installment in our series of discussions around the controversial topic of reparations for slavery. First, a bit of a disclaimer. The Center does not advocate in any way for the adoption of this particular initiative. Our focus is rather to stimulate a desire to understand the issues that have brought this topic to the fore in our political discourse. Racial harmony has fostered these kinds of conversations since our founding over 27 years ago. We're a 501c3 community organization dedicated to understanding, communicating, and cooperating along the way to achieving more harmonious social interaction. Our first section in the series was live on Facebook last month. And in case you missed it, the video is still available on our page. That session covered the period of slavery and its immediate aftermath. Tonight, we'll continue with the discussion of Reconstruction and the period that followed up until the 2000s. Before we get underway, I'd like to thank you first for tuning in to our presentation. And I'd also like to thank the Board of Directors, the Planning Committee, and last but not least, our technical expert who have all been instrumental in making this important venture possible. With that, I'll yield to our very able moderator and my good friend, Robert Wells, who's the ambassador for the Center for Racial Harmony, who will introduce our panelists and let the enlightening begin. Bob?
Gerald, thank you. Good evening. It's my pleasure to be part of this program. I'm going to try to be in the background and use the expertise, the knowledge, the wisdom, and the decades of teaching and study that have gone on to making each of our panelists what they are today. And they are a learned panel, which I think can give you a great deal of insight on some things that were missing in the history books when I was growing up. Between the ages of 6 and when I graduated from high school at 17, I'm not sure I'm going to learn a lot of, I'm going to know a lot of the things that are going to be talked about this evening, because our history books didn't always give us the full picture of everything that needed to be understood. So with that said, I'm going to introduce the panel. We have two college professors. First, we have Dr. Lauren Thompson. Thank you for joining us, Lauren. And she is the Director of Ethnic and Gender Studies and an Assistant Professor of History at McKendree University. Next, we have Timothy Lewis. He is the Assistant Professor of the Department of Political Science at SIU Edwardsville. Both of those individuals have PhDs in their professions. Another PhD and an MBA is Dr. A. Wayne Jones, who is with us, and he will enlighten us with some of his practical experiences in the field. And last, but certainly not least, we have Ray Boshara, who is a senior advisor for the Institute of Economic Equity with our own St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. He's going to give us some insight and some of the quantification of the economic impact of what happened during this period of time from Reconstruction through the 1960s. That's the goal. But if we travel down the road and we find ourselves in an interesting topic, and with the knowledge being, put forth by each of our panelists, we may decide to delay getting to the end and make certain that we don't lose track of the journey we're on, because the purpose of this is to give ourselves a greater insight. I'm not going to cover again what Gerald did as to what the Center for Racial Harmony is about. I am going to just go through one part of the exercise. When I do these programs, I use the acronym ROPE, and I do that for a very specific reason. And that's because of the fact we want to have a positive discussion and we want to have a dialogue. So ROPE stands for respecting what you're hearing, being open. We're not going to get all bound up with political correctness. We want to have it go out with the right emotion, the right tone, the right intention. We're not going to worry about always picking the perfect word. The perfect word sometimes means we don't speak. We want to be positive. We're not here to criticize or critique someone who's spoken before us, but we're going to give a positive bent on what we feel might be the appropriate approach or the facts as we understand them to be. And last, empathy. Empathetic listening is critical to this whole exercise. With that said, what I'd like to do is give each of the panelists an opportunity to see if they want to have some opening remarks. And I'd start with Dr. Jones. Would you have any comments for us, Wayne?
Yes, I'd just like to say that, first of all, I appreciate being a part of this forum. It's certainly a great opportunity to candidly discuss the history of this period and the challenges that we are facing today. And they're varied and many. And my hope, my aspiration here this evening is to take a look at a number of these things to see how we can see just what the evidence, past and present, presents to us so that we can make the kinds of decisions and resolve to move ahead so that we may experience together liberty and pursuit of happiness among ourselves.
Thank you. Dr. Lauren Thompson, would you like to have any comments for us this evening?
Sure. First, I want to echo what Dr. Jones said. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm really excited about the conversation and joining with my fellow panelists. One thing that I wanted to mention for the audience, just to kind of think about, is something that I come across in my classrooms all the time. Two of the classes that I teach at McKendree University are Race and Ethnic Minorities in America, and then Black History in America. And regardless of where my students come from, what race they are, or even where they grew up, they are so surprised that almost everything that we talk about in the class is something that they never heard before. And so one of the questions that I have for you all who are listening to think about is, while we are going over this material and these facts and this historical evidence, is to think why you may have never heard of these stories or these examples, or why you may never have learned them. And so that's kind of my challenge for you tonight. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis.
Good afternoon to everyone. I am Dr. Timothy Lewis. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. I'm an identity politics researcher, which means I look at how people identify and how that identity shapes their political thoughts and behavior. And I am also a social justice activist in the traditions of W.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin. I just want to briefly say that as we explore this conversation on reparations, it is important that we really understand how the injuries of the past create current inequitable conditions. We cannot look at this as just something that happened in yesteryear, and that if we fail to act currently, at best, we are by design giving some implicit agreement to the racial inequity that we currently have. I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Ray, would you like to join us?
Of course. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. I'm the least educated person on the panel here. I don't have a PhD. I work at the Fed, so naturally my contribution here is to talk about the economic data, especially about the racial wealth gap. You know, your assets, your net worth, everything you own less everything you owe. and why that's an important barometer of our overall progress on achieving racial equity. And I think, it's really important to understand this problem in terms of the racial wealth gap. And I wish we had data that went back 150 years ago. We don't, at least not economic data at households, but we can go back to about the 50s. And it's pretty clear that the racial wealth gap, despite other progress, hasn't really changed very much since the mid 1950s. So there's something that's not working. How can we make other progress and it's not changing the amount of wealth that Black families have? And that's something I hope we can explore, because I think it does provide a key into how we think about racial equity overall.
Can I ask you one quick question? One thing that I'm not sure I mentioned was that you are the senior advisor to the Institute for Economic Equality. Would you explain to our audience briefly what that stands for, or what that does?
Sure. We're recently launched Institute for Economic Equity, and what we're trying to do is look at economic equity broadly. So not just the racial wealth gap, but generational wealth gap, the educational wealth gap, gender. We're looking at different forms of inequity, including wealth, but also income, geography. I mean, basically what we want to do, we envision a world where things you don't control, like where you're born, who your parents are, your race, your gender, do not influence your economic outcomes. That's our main purpose, is to try to remove the systematic barriers that prevent people who put in equal effort and have equal opportunity to have relatively equal economic outcomes. That's our purpose.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the things that starts this program off is, why are we going through this history? Well, sometimes when you have a problem, you have to go back through the history in order to find out how it has evolved. When you go to a doctor, one of the main things that the doctor does is the doctor asks for your history. And not only your history, sometimes your family history. And so this evening, what I'd like to do is let us look back to that history. We're not going to get into the answers to the questions of reparations, pro, con, or what the solutions may be tonight, but we will be laying the groundwork for a better understanding as to what we're working with and why it's there. So we're going to start with right after the Civil War. Right after the Civil War, actually the finishing up of the Civil War, General Sherman issued a special field order number 15. Does any panelist want to take the opportunity to, explain what that might be? Dr.
I'll go
Thompson,
ahead.
I'm going to let you do that.
So in Savannah, Georgia, when Sherman, in December of 1864, captured the city of Savannah, not only did he wire President Lincoln and say, "Merry Christmas, here's the city of Savannah," but I have this idea that we could take land from Southern slaveholders in Georgia and redistribute it to freed people or enslaved people who were at that time kind of in this liminal space known as contraband. They followed Union armies hoping for some sort of, safety, but also for Black men to join and put on the blue uniform and fight. And this commonly becomes what we know as 40 acres and a mule. And so the idea was that there would be a massive redistribution of wealth so that families and freed people would be able to have the land that their ancestors had worked for 246 years since 1619 in order to have that land to start their families and start earning what we call generational wealth. However, that did not come to fruition, and there was no 40 acres and a mule established despite Sherman's idea, and then the Reconstruction period that attempted to see some sort of progress with the Freedmen's Bureau, which we can get into if we want, which was to protect and to provide freed people with something as simple as finding their families who've been displaced during slavery, to choose a last name, to get married, to learn to read and write, to be able to earn a wage and do things that they never had been able to do in the traditional sense of what those mean in a court of law. And so unfortunately, the promise, or the 40 acres and a mule notion that came out of General Orders number 15 never came to fruition.
Ray, I'm going to pick on you now. You have any idea what 40 acres and a mule would be worth today if we translate those numbers from back in 1865 to today?
No, I have no idea, but it's a great question, because the people who do write about reparations use that as a starting point, the lost promise. And some scholars have tried to estimate what that number would be today. And there's different ways of figuring out what, if we were to make reparations, what the amount would be, and it is based on differences in net worth. And probably the best estimate that I've seen, if you were to fast forward the cumulative effect of being denied property, starting with 40 acres and a mule, and then moving forward, is by Sandy Darity at Duke University. And he's recommending that we aim for about the gap in average wealth, not median wealth, the gap in average wealth between white and Black Americans today, which comes out to about $840,000 per person. So it's a pretty substantial number, but it's probably, but it does represent the cumulative effect, of not having wealth since, since 40 acres and a mule did not materialize. And I think that's probably the estimate that many scholars would rally behind.
And again, I want to make it very clear that that last comment was not intended to say that's what any recommendation is. We're just talking about one of the metrics that goes along with this discussion and these questions. I'm going to turn now to Wayne, if you would. Could you tell us what the 13th Amendment was, which passed right after that in January of 1865?
Yes, the 13th Amendment presumptively ended slavery. However, it actually restructured it, criminalized it. It's interesting that Charles Sumner's first draft proposal of the 13th Amendment did not include any reference to crime, to conviction or imprisonment, but that was handily rejected. And the 13th Amendment, which of course involves conviction and imprisonment for those convicted, what it does, it's a catch-all system, which, although slavery was ended in terms of the political aspect of it, but there was practically the recapturing of Blacks through criminalization, which again created a slave labor. Convicts become property of the state in which they're convicted, loss of rights, loss of mobility, loss of freedom, loss of today ability to vote, and loss of their economic viability, such as it is.
So what I think I'm hearing you say is the fact that the 13th Amendment may have had some words, but they weren't really put into practice with reference to what we would think as being the full freedom that was expected.
No, it did not end slavery. It restructured it, and it became actually the beginning of the penal industrial complex, which penalized former slaves for being convicts, and then they, of course, were targeted. So when we think of the 13th Amendment, it is not an instrument of liberation. That's the sad and candid truth today, which we see so much devastation resulting from it. That, of course, has to be revisited and acknowledged.
Tim, there was at the same time as that was taking place, in conjunction with what was just mentioned by Wayne, is the issue concerning the black codes that went into place by some of the southern states at that time. Could you explain what those were?
Yes, the Black codes were a revamping of the slave codes. The slave codes were laws geared solely towards slaves, to regulate both their behavior and to some degree their thought. I find it ironic, though, that when you think about the slave codes and the Black codes, during slavery, Black people were considered property, and you don't make laws for chairs or tables because they're inanimate objects. But yet there were laws for slaves, though they were considered property. Coming out of the Civil War, the Black codes were really designed to replicate the dehumanization that Black people face under slavery. Dr. Frank Tolan goes into a great oration as to how the Black codes were a legal revamping of the slave codes. They dehumanized Blacks. Humiliated Blacks. There's an example. One of the laws under the Black codes was a sidewalk law. And so if a white person and a Black person were both walking from opposing sides down a sidewalk, the Black person was supposed to get off the sidewalk and give the right of way to the white person. And if they did not do that, or did not do it in an appeasing manner, they could be beaten or even put to death simply for not getting off the sidewalk fast enough. That was a very humiliating thing for, you think about a 40-year-old Black male having to get off the sidewalk and bow to some degree to a coming, 16-year-old white adolescent. This type of humiliation, dehumanization is what the Black codes embody.
Could you give me any estimate as to the length of time those Black codes were in operation, or how long they were in play with reference to certain states?
Well, right after the Civil War, Northern soldiers infiltrated, they were purposely put into the South to enforce this new paradigm, but they were withdrawn in 1877. And we have evidence in Virginia, Mississippi, and Alabama that Black codes were put in place that same year that the Northern soldiers withdrew from the South.
And would you say how long those codes were still practiced in those various states?
Black codes, one of my mentors is Fred Gray. If you don't know who Fred Gray is, he is the lawyer for Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks in the Civil Rights Movement. If you've ever seen the movie Selma, he's played by Cuba Gooding Jr. in that movie. Fred teaches that the Black codes were in place at least up until 1968 and to some degree up until 1972.
So in essence, those were in play for almost 100 years.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Anything else at that time before we get to the 14th Amendment? And what I'd call upon is maybe if Lauren could give us the understanding what the 14th Amendment is all about.
Sure. The 14th Amendment is, wow, how do I start with this? One of the important things about I don't know if you talked about it in the last series, is the Dred Scott decision of 1857. This is kind of what we see, very local history, right? Dred Scott and his wife basically sued for their freedom because their master took them to a free state, and the Supreme Court of the United States said that not only is a person of color chattel or property and can be taken anywhere, but Dred Scott and his wife didn't even have the right to be in court because no person of color, whether free or slave, has due process of law. And 10 years after the Dred Scott decision in 1867 is when the 14th Amendment is passed. Now, some context to the 14th Amendment is Southern states seceded from the United States. So they, after the Civil War, immediately want to take back their seats in the US Senate. They want to pretend like really nothing ever happened. But the Republican Congress at the time, the ones who backed the late President Lincoln, kind of try to take the reins back. Dr. Jones mentioned Charles Sumner. He's one of these men, an abolitionist that says we need to protect freedmen and we need to be sure that Southerners understand that. And so in order for Confederate states to actually get back into the country and join in reunifying the nation, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. And so what the 14th Amendment does is it acknowledges Black citizenship. And there's also, if you've ever heard, this is in recent events too, is the notion of birthright citizenship. And so it says that any person born in the United States is thus a US citizen. So it restores and overturns the Dred Scott decision, and in the Constitution finally gives citizenship to people of color. And if we remember way back to the 3/5 Compromise, slavery is in the Constitution and says that that didn't happen. And so the 14th Amendment on paper gives citizenship and due process and equality under the law. Now, is that carried out? That's something I think we can kind of turn over to the panel.
We'll get into some of that this evening, but it only provided for male, correct? Only for males.
The 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote in 1870.
No, but I'm speaking as far as it didn't give it to females at that time. The 14th Amendment, or do you think it did?
Women definitely, I don't know if somebody else wants to chime in, did not have a lot of control over their own property, divorce, voting, but I'm not sure that the 14th Amendment was exclusively for men.
Okay, I just impression I just wanted to clear up. After that, there was the Civil Rights Act of 1871. Anyone want to cover that? Timothy? Wayne?
Bob?
Yes, okay.
I'd like to just make a reference and aside.
Yes,
pardon
certainly.
me, to the Dred Scott decision, particularly the Missouri decision. There was a dissenting decision by Justice Curtis against the Missouri Supreme Court decision, and Justice Curtis, in his very long dissent, it covers about 90 pages. One of the things he makes reference to is that during the First and Second Continental Congress, nearly half or more of the representatives, of the 55 representatives of the Continental Congress, were Black, or what were at that time called Moors. And on the basis of the decision that Black people were not citizens under the Constitution, nor had any standing in court, this is one of the major points of Justice Curtis's dissension, that with the founding of the country under the Continental Congress, that the nation was represented by Moors, and of the 55 representatives, depending on the literature reading, 25 or 35 of those representatives were in fact Black or Moors, which in his dissent, he indicated invalidated that decision. I wanted to insert that. Thank you.
Certainly.
And I will briefly chime in on the Civil Rights Act of 1871. You threw me off a little bit because I know it as the Ku Klux Klan Act.
Well, I was going to let you say that. I was going to say it for you.
And basically, it was passed in conjunction with the 14th Amendment as this supposedly federal legislation that protected Blacks from the violence of the KKK. However, you have a fundamental problem here. And this is not to slant anyone currently in law enforcement, but at this time, you have to understand that the majority of your white police force was a evolution out of the slave patrol. So a lot of the people in place to enforce the KKK Act were members of the KKK. So you have this contradictory paradigm. You can't enforce a law that will then therefore make you guilty, So you had a law on paper that was never enforced.
Okay, very good. There also was the 14th Amendment. There was the slaughterhouse cases in the Supreme Court. Anyone would like to speak to that, which dealt with how they dealt with the citizenship between state and U.S. citizens as far as the obligation? If not, we'll move on to some of the things that were going on in the South at that time. Now, you mentioned the KKK. The KKK had come into play. Were there things that took place in the South in the 1870s that would be indicative of the KKK having a dominant force in the communities?
Yeah, you could start with the Colfax massacre. I'm
Okay.
not sure if anybody is familiar with that, but it's one of the earliest what we call race riots or race massacres to happen after the Civil War. And one of the things that was going on was, as we talked about, U.S. troops are there to ensure fair and safe and equal elections after 1870 because Black men can vote. And we do see Hiram Revels, the first Black U.S. senator elected in Mississippi, and Joseph Rainey, the first Black congressman elected out of South Carolina, because these are predominantly Black districts, right? Some of these districts are 90% Black because slave plantations were 1,000 people of color. So when we see Black men and Republicans being elected into former Southern Democrat seats, the white vengeance or the, I guess you could say, anger over seeing former slaves being able to vote, they're going to take action. And one of the things they do, and we can talk more about some of the ways they try to, states pass grandfather clauses, poll taxes, literacy tests, but then using extra legal and violence. And so in the Colfax massacre, we don't even know how many Black men were killed by white vigilante violence. And some of these were Black militia. It ranges between, I believe, 56 and 123 people, Black people who were killed just because they were there. They didn't do anything other than they were there. And so any Black person becomes a target as people or white Klan members and people who want to overturn an election speak with violence, and there's no legal consequences for these people because many of them are the sheriffs and the bailiffs and sit on the juries. And so this is the beginning of what we'll see throughout this period, is basically white violence without repercussions. And we can talk more about that, but that's one of the earliest, the Colfax massacre in Louisiana.
And I think you're alluding to a point that I think that will be made throughout the evening, and that is, that was one incident in which there were, let's say, an estimate of 100 people who were killed by reason of this act. And yet there are a number of those things that were taking place in other states. That was in Louisiana, but there were things taking place, I think. Maybe explain the White League. What was the White League? Yeah. Familiar with that? Would you describe what that was in the other communities? Yeah.
I know that there was not just the Ku Klux Klan, but the White League and the Knights of the White Camellia. So there were several of these kind of white vigilante groups. Is that what you're referring to?
I was referring to that, and also the fact that there were elected officials who were sometimes actually put out of office by groups of that nature. Do you have any instances of that taking place? There was an incident in New Orleans where they had the issue of a person demanding that one of the governor leave office and put their own governor in. Something I had never heard of before. Timothy, are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with that, but I do want to mention that
Certainly.
In this time context, the law was two-faced. On one hand, you had things like the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the KKK Act. But then in 1872, you had the General Amnesty Act. which generally pardoned everyone in the South except about 75 high-ranking ex-Confederate officers. So now you have an emboldening of people who committed basically treason and now are pardoned for it. And these are the very people who would go and bully and intimidate hiring rebels and these newly elected Black people to these state legislators, and even to the point of committing these massacres and killing them. So it wasn't just a de facto event as a result of frustrated people. The law actually emboldened people to commit this violence in this time frame.
And you would think that time frame would be from when to when?
Well, you're really going to begin around 1872 with the General Amnesty Act, and the violence against people of color continues today.
Okay. During
Bob,
this thing,
I'd like to.
Certainly. Who's that?
No, I'd also like to insert one thing as we're discussing this, the issue between Black and white animus in the country. There's a book written by Terrence Allen III. It's a 2-volume book, and the title is The Invention of the White Race, how the instance of the designation of the white race in America came to be, and how at the very beginning of the founding or development of the nation created this cleavage, which actually was permeated the jurisprudence of the country. So that's an issue we do have to take a look at, because only in America does this phenomena take place. And so we have the designations of Black and white under American law, first colonial, then of course, further statutory, then that sets the tone for what legalizes what we're seeing and what has taken place. And that's an area that one attorney, Better Laura, talks about, and others. And that's one of the things I think that many times we overlook, possibly the elephant in the room or possibly the oxygen in the room, that we have to really focus on, because when we talk about race, there really is only one race, the human race, and the many various branches of various melanation. So as we look at this, as we're wanting to get to, say, truth and justice and reconciliation, we find that that has been an animus behind these laws that Dr. Lewis spoke of and Dr. Thompson spoke of, that we started on a foundation with artificial terms and definitions that created these inequitable entitlements and then animus and injustice. I wanted to add that to the discussion.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to get to Jim Crow in just a minute, but I want to bring Ray back into the discussion. Ray, in 1879, there were thousands of African Americans who were living in segregation in the South and started to migrate primarily to Kansas. And the question I'd pose to you is, when groups migrate to a new community, is there an economic consequence that oftentimes they would confront and face when they move from one area to another and then start competing with the current, the local labor force?
Well, I think the historians can answer that better than I, but I think it's pretty clear that there are both costs and benefits to moving. The Great Migration to the north resulted in all kinds of economic opportunities for people of color and throughout Chicago. But for example, it also laid the groundwork for great segregation in the city of Chicago as well. I mean, people historically have always moved for better opportunity, and I don't think people of color are any different than that. But when you mentioned Kansas, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to go back just a couple of years before 40 acres and a mule did not happen. There was the Homestead Act in US history, which many of you know, if you received the land, if you agreed to work it for 5 years, it was yours. It was an enormous property transfer, basically taken from Native Americans and given to white settlers on the frontier. And there's a study showing that 1/4 of all Americans alive today can trace their legacy of property ownership to the Homestead Act, and it's yet another policy from which people of color were excluded. So I just wanted to bring that in. We started just a little bit after that, but I thought it was an important policy. When I think of Kansas, I think of homesteading.
What would the year have been for the Homestead Act?
It's
My wife?
62.
I'm sorry?
1862, yes, 1862.
Okay,
That's
so
correct.
again, it's
Right.
another indication of an impediment to generational wealth. And this is an example of how one group was excluded from the opportunity of property ownership that was available to others.
Again, keep in mind, literally 1/4 of all Americans today, white Americans, can trace their legacy of property ownership to that one act, right? So it's really a remarkable number. And even if you go back to 40 acres and a mule, say each freed slave got 10 acres, you're talking about 40 million acres of property that would be in the hands of African Americans today. And if you think about the value of that, it's into the trillions, 10 to 20 trillion dollars. And it is one of the basis for calculating, as I mentioned earlier, what reparations would be today.
And again, as far as what they'd be and what those costs would be, we're just trying to get how history has influenced and caused these impediments and disadvantages and inequities to arise. Jim Crow, that's a term that's used for a lot of this period of time. I wonder if, Timothy, you might be able to give us a better definition of what that term actually means.
Yes, yes, I will gladly. Jim Crow actually started during slavery, but it was really a societal and structural way to subjugate Blacks post-slavery. So in the early 1830s, a white actor by the name of Thomas Dartmouth, his nickname was Daddy Rice. He was propelled to stardom because he had this minstrel routine in which he had this fictional character called Jim Crow. And Jim Crow was a caricature of a clumsy, dim-witted Black man. And Rice claimed to have developed this character from witnessing an elderly Black man in Kentucky who would sing and dance to a tune of a song called Jump Jim Crow. And so he later appropriated the Jim Crow persona, and it was really a persona that Blacks were intellectually inferior. They did not have any talents or natural skills or ability, and they were incapable of being included into what we would consider society at a level of decorum that was sufficient for white society at the time. And that's the beginning of Jim Crow. What Jim Crow evolved into was a system of laws and both culture by which that suppressed any notion of Blackness. And when white people committed violence against Blacks, there were no consequences for them under Jim Crow. You had the Tulsa massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You had the Rosewood massacre. All of these things were a manifestation of Jim Crow.
Would you say that, would you carry that further as far as the issues concerning elections?
So yes, Jim Crow, you had various mechanisms by which Jim Crow disenfranchised Black people from voting. So we know that the 15th Amendment supposedly gave everyone the right to vote. But when Black Americans would try to register to vote, they would be intimidated and sometimes killed. And then when they would go to certain places to register, Fred Gray outlines this in his autobiography, Bus Ride to Justice. They would be required to recite the Constitution, something that most citizens can't do even today. And then once they would go home and memorize it, they would come and they would recite it with confidence because they wanted to vote. And then the clerk would say, now do it backwards. that were poll taxes, paying excessive amounts of taxes in order to vote. There were literacy tests. All of these barriers were legally put in place and only applied to Black people during Jim Crow.
Lauren, can you tell us what the grandfather clause was related to that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that because I have a statistic about this. After the landmark court case, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896.
Would you tell our audience what that was? I know I'm familiar with. You need to do that, please.
So Homer Plessy was a wealthy Black man. He was very light-skinned. So he was almost, as what people would say, could pass for white. But like most of these things we see in Black history, like Rosa Parks was a plant. They had her bail money ready. She was not just a tired woman. She was the secretary of the NAACP. Homer Plessy was the same way. He was in New Orleans. He and his friends devised this plan where he would buy a first class ticket. They alerted the authorities because he wanted to sit in the white section as a man of color in order to challenge the Separate Car Act in Louisiana. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and in a 7-1 decision, the court said that separate is equal. And as a result, Louisiana passed a grandfather clause the following year, which said if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you couldn't vote, or if your grandfather was a slave, you could not vote. And so prior to that time, 130,000 Black men voted in the election of 1896. And then after the grandfather clause was passed, it was 1,342 Black men voted in 1904. So you could see that from 130,000 to 1,300, that state law was extremely effective in limiting Black voices in not just federal elections, but state and local. And another thing is we get our jury pool from voter registration. So that is only going to continue seeing all white juries in courts of law.
And that brings me back to Ray again. Ray, you talked about the generational wealth from the Homestead Act, and we've talked about some of the other things that have interfered with generational wealth. Not having the franchise to vote, would that have an economic impact on a segment of society?
Sure. We haven't really done studies on this, but yes. I mean, think about it. What does voting do? It allocates wealth. It allocates subsidies. It allocates property. It determines who gets property, who doesn't get property. You know, and so certainly disenfranchising people at the polls limits their ability to weigh in on the taxation of the very property they own or they don't own. I mean, this is one of the critiques of the concentration of wealth, is that too few people control the political process, and whose wealth is protected, whose is not, what happens to the tax code, what gets subsidized. But it's not surprising that the tax code itself today actually is an engine of the racial wealth gap, because basically you get larger tax breaks, you know, if you have a bigger mortgage or or you save more for retirement. Well, since most wealthy people are white, you end up subsidizing white wealth accumulation, even though it's not on purpose. Look, whether it's the lack of 160 acres getting delivered through the Homestead Act, or 40 acres and a mule not happening, or the failure to save the Freedmen's Bank, all these policies, result in the inability of Blacks to accumulate wealth. You either accumulate wealth by getting it through your family or getting it through your government, and usually those work in tandem. And if you don't have those opportunities, you can't accumulate wealth, because wealth begets wealth. You either have it or you don't. So, the basic, the fundamental answer is yes, voting matters enormously, because it determines who gets property, who doesn't, whose is protected and whose is not. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
Okay. Previously, you talked about the Great Migration, and I want to switch back to Wayne again and say, when that took place, the migration took place, and we have the Southern Blacks going north, looking for jobs in industry. What took place with reference to those who were currently holding those jobs at the time? Was there any friction that arose from that?
Okay, would you repeat the question again?
Certainly.
You broke up a little bit.
Certainly. During the Great Migration, there was a great move northward towards more industrial cities. And when
Yes.
Blacks moved into those industrial cities, where the industries were primarily occupied by white workers, what was the impact as far as the friction between those two groups?
Oh, well, as you can imagine, there was a great deal of resentment and hostility, because while you had the migration in many instances in the St. Louis area up south, there was friction with whites and their employers with their concern with being paid adequate wages and strikes. And at the time that you had the migration of Blacks coming up north, they were seen by many as strike breakers and taking over jobs and displacing whites. Now, given the attitude of white workers toward Blacks, and they're seeking economic opportunities, there was a double, and in some instances, a triple backlash, which resulted in riots, as well as the kinds of things that took place right across the river, 1917 in East St. Louis and other places around the country. So this was a very combustible time. However, many whites saw it as the threat of being displaced, as well as the resentment of Blacks coming to industrialized areas to better themselves.
Michelle, if you would be kind enough, would you put up the visual concerning Reconstruction, because it deals a little with the graphic of the Great Migration. In the lower left-hand corner, right-hand corner, that is the migration that was being described by Wayne at the time. And it started earlier, but it continued during the period of time in the early part of the 1900s. Does anybody have any specific stories relative to either what happened in Springfield in 1909 or what happened in East St. Louis in 1917?
Talk about either.
Okay, Laura, go ahead.
Well, first I want to unpack what white means, because there's a little bit more going on here. This is when my family came. My family came, the Great Migration for people of color leaving the Jim Crow South is a long period from 1900 through the Civil Rights era. So it's a very long period, but at that kind of first quarter of the 20th century is when we see Eastern European and Southern Europeans immigrants coming. My family from Eastern Europe came at this time. And so my family did not speak English. They were very poor. They were uneducated and trying to get a blue collar job to kind of do the same thing that people of color leaving the Jim Crow South were trying to do. And so unfortunately, this is where we see how race is made and how European immigrants try to claim their whiteness alongside native born white Americans. And they join in and choose racial solidarity and white supremacy over class. And so that's one of the most difficult things that we see at this time. And so in East St. Louis, just as the Reverend said, is the aluminum ore company was a company that was paying their workers very poor wages. And when white and European immigrants struck against those wages, that is when we saw young men coming up from the Jim Crow South needing a job and they took those low wages. And so instead of this group of white and European workers channeling their frustrations over their low wages at their bosses, they channeled them against these strikebreakers or these men of color coming up from the South. And so again, when we see these race massacres happen, they're not going to the homes of the men who broke the strikes, because these neighborhoods are segregated and Black Americans are kept out of white and European neighborhoods. East St. Louis was like a sitting duck. And so white St. Louisans went across the Eads Bridge to basically begin shooting Black families and then throwing fire bombs on their homes. And when the fire department came to help put out the fires, the white mob cut the fire hoses and shot people fleeing their homes on fire. And when Black East St. Louis tried to escape the flames, they ran across the Eads Bridge and were also met with a firing squad over here at the corner of Washington Avenue and 4th, right downtown. And no one was charged for this crime. Some Black people were said to have jumped off the bridge because they had to choose to run back to the east side where their homes were on fire or face a firing squad. And so unfortunately, this kind of incident is going to create generational trauma for the survivors, for the Black communities at this time. And even though that was 100 years ago, that is embedded within the generations of people in our community. And so that's kind of the summary of East St. Louis, if somebody else wants to talk about what happened in Springfield.
Any volunteers for Springfield? I think the point has been well taken as far as, you know, the intimidation and the friction that took place there. And again, I'm not going to put Ray on the spot of asking him the question of whether or not the ability to enter into the labor force in the unions, or not the unions, but in the blue collar work, and being excluded from it has an impact on generational wealth as well. Then we start, and we're getting into the period of time in which we're into the First World War. Does anybody have any thoughts concerning the First World War and its impact with reference to the accumulation of wealth or the segregation of the armed services? Okay, then there was a Rosewood massacre that took place in 1923. Anyone familiar with that, in which there were 6 African Americans who were killed in Rosewood, Florida?
I'll speak briefly on that, and I'm speaking from a position of some family history. My grandmother, my late grandmother, Stella Walsh, is a survivor of the Rosewood massacre. She informs my mother all the time of how she could hear the horses in pursuit of them as they fled Rosewood, and they eventually settled in Alabama. The Rosewood massacre all started because Fannie Taylor was a white woman in Rosewood who had an abusive husband, and her husband beat her. And at this point, it became visible that she was being abused. And rather than admit that her husband was the culprit, she lied on a Black man. And that led to the entire massacre of the Rosewood. Now, some historians say only 6 people died. From the historians that I've delved into, that number is much higher than 6 people. And then you look at all of the property that was destroyed, burned, including Black churches and homes. You're looking at today, counting for inflation, millions of dollars of damage. And then you look at the psychological trauma that is passed down through generations, like my own family. You see an immeasurable cost as a result of the Rosewood massacre. And similarly to the other patterns of history, no one was punished as a result of that crime.
And one of the things that I have not asked about, and I think we just need to allude to it in general terms rather than specific terms, unless someone has a specific story to relate, and that is the intimidation of a group of people sometimes involves picking one person out And unfortunately, there were some lynchings that took place throughout the South. Would anybody be able to provide any statistics as to what was involved in that?
Well,
Over
this,
the-
oh,
Yes.
sorry, Bob.
Sure.
I was going to say this alludes to what Tim was saying earlier with this notion of racial etiquette, and especially Black men, were seen as a threat to white women, and white women were put on a pedestal. And so all somebody like me would have to say is, that man looked at me, and there was no kind of due justice or any kind of evidence. The lynch mobs, which were not just men, these were public, very open kind of, I guess you could say there's children, there's women, people took souvenirs from them, and it becomes this culture in the South. Billie Holiday's song Strange Fruit, if you Google the lyrics, she writes about this kind of culture in the South that becomes embedded in the notion of dehumanization of Black bodies and the lack of rights for people accused of something as simple as not getting off the sidewalk for someone like me. And there was over 4,000 lynchings that we know of, because people disappeared. People, were just never found, thrown in rivers, buried, and burned beyond recognition. But there was 4,000 lynchings. The Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama actually has this kind of new exhibit, this new kind of commemoration for the victims. But in the worst year, I believe it was 1896, I believe there was, I want to say like 232 lynchings in a year. So that's 5 a week. And of the states in which lynchings happened, Mississippi was the highest number, but it did not just stop at the Mason-Dixon line or the Mississippi River. It was in the Midwest. It was in kind of the areas of Oklahoma and Kansas. And so this vigilantism that leads to this, one of the most horrific parts of American history, is kind of what I went back to in my opening comment, is people don't want to talk about it because white silence is violence. And because these groups that were there watching this happen didn't do anything to stop it, but also not be able to see the empathy of what if that was my son, really embedded fear and trauma in the Black community and privilege in the white community. And that is kind of where we see the economic come through, just with what Tim was saying about with Rosewood. We see that happen with Black Wall Street in the Greenwood district in Tulsa. And that all started because a white woman said a Black elevator operator touched her inappropriately. So there is this thread between the culture of Jim Crow and how it prohibits Black wealth.
Ray, I'm going to get back to you for a quick question. When you started your presentation, you made a comment about some of the insecurities that exist today with reference to housing, education, healthcare, and so forth. Have you seen any of the things that we've talked about today that give precursors to that would be generational from one generation to the next, that would have an impact with reference to the health of a certain segment of society?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Bob.
Well, my question was designed, I'll get right to it. I was suddenly going to get into the issue concerning the Tuskegee study concerning syphilis. And I was going to get into that through the back door by saying that, the impact upon individuals of the nature we've been talking about has an impact on their health and their well-being, and then get into the issue of what happened with the Tuskegee study. I'll let you go wherever you want with that now.
Yeah, really, really broad topic. I mean, there's certainly a pretty profound relationship between good health and having wealth, and health predicts wealth, wealth predicts health. Some of you may know that if you look at 2 adjoining zip codes in St. Louis, one in Clayton, one in North St. Louis. There's a lifespan difference of 18 years, simply by two communities that are, separated by just a few miles, which is a remarkable number. 18 years difference in lifespan between Blacks and whites. I mean, you think about the fact that if we were to end all cancers, we would extend life by about 3 years. And so when you're talking about an 18-year lifespan between Blacks and whites, it's pretty remarkable. And I would point out that, of course, you have a poverty rate in excess of 80% in the Black community and less than 4% in the white community. So there's a really, really strong relationship between the two. I'll just make that observation, and if others want to weigh in historically about this issue, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. Anyone like to jump in there?
Yes.
Certainly, Wayne, go ahead.
Yes. When we talk about the issues of wealth disparity, morbidity, and longevity, we're really talking about the results of systemic policy, be it economic, be it political, be it health protocols. And, we talk about the Tuskegee experiment and others. And I want to just put a parenthetic in here. Years ago, when I was young, we lived in the Pruitt-Igoe housing projects. Later on, we came to discover that we were subjects of military chemical experimentation. Of course, we survived that, not knowing that we were guinea pigs of biochemical experimentation. And we have to look at these systemic policies that target Blacks and other people of color in America with the advent of the Eugenics Society. Now,
Would you tell the individual in the audience what eugenics is about?
Yes,
Thank
eugenics. Yes, it is an organization, a system that has as its objective the reduction or elimination of inferior genetic materials. In America, Blacks are the principal targets. So annihilation, extermination, and genocide through the various lines of infrastructure in American culture and structure. So when we look at these various instances that are taking place, Tuskegee experiment is only one instance of it. Now, as we consider, these initiatives, not only must we be—
the Tuskegee incident took place in 1932, just to give perspective to individuals as far as a time frame. And could you give us a time frame for eugenics as well?
Oh yes, that goes back to the early 20s of the country, up through the 30s with Margaret Sanger, and also the Negro Project, which took place in 1930. So we're looking at, and how I want to say this, we're looking at a program that's designed to exterminate a target population. So when we talk about policy, wealth gaps, and what have you, all of those are part of an overall program that involve the eugenics. Of course, they changed the name to the Society of Social Psychology, very innocuous name. But we find this behind these statistics that we see. And as Dr. Thompson indicated, these are simply not natural social evolution. So as we consider the offenses, those are the kinds of things we also have to consider. The systemic animus against Blacks in America.
Thank you. Michelle, would you be kind enough to put up this second visual? While she's doing that, I want to raise another issue. And again, I get back to Ray on this one. You've talked previously about how the wealth of a portion of the white populace can be traced back to the Homestead Act and the property that was acquired there. Could you give us an idea as to what the impact would be if a certain segment of the community was not permitted to purchase property in the more desirable sections of communities by redlining, by restrictive covenants, by reason of laws that simply said that you couldn't live in the neighborhood if you were a certain race, and your impressions of that?
Well, certainly, I think property ownership largely revolved around land for most of our history. It shifted, especially in the 20th century when the federal government decided to start subsidizing home ownership. But they did so in a very racially motivated way. And literally, what happened is that the loans made by the Federal Housing Administration, the guidance that they put out to the banks, they basically literally drew either green or red lines and others around those areas. And if you lived in an area that was outlined in red, you were considered too risky for a loan and therefore couldn't get a loan that would buy the house. And so that's where the term redlining came from. But it turns out to be one of the most significant contributors to the racial wealth gap today. The fact that people of color were not allowed to own homes and to accumulate wealth and to pass those on to future generations. And even today, Blacks are far more likely to buy homes in neighborhoods that have lower housing values and not experience as much appreciation in the homes that they do own. And they also tend to buy them later in life, which means they get less time for that accumulation. So homeownership, and as I mentioned earlier, it continues to be the racial wealth gap, including subsidization of homeownership, continues today through the tax code, because you get a larger tax break if you have a larger mortgage. Larger mortgages are overwhelmingly, can be afforded by white people, and so they get a larger tax break. So, this is one of those instances where there were deliberate policies to exclude people of color, but even current policies, and Dorothy Brown has a wonderful book out on this topic called The Whiteness of Wealth, showing how the tax code continues to subsidize contributes to the racial wealth gap today. But you can't understand the history of the racial wealth gap without understanding the unfortunate history of segregation in housing markets that continues to today.
Thank you. As I said when we started this evening, that our goal was to get to the 1960s. As you can see, we're not going to get there. We've basically gotten to about the Second World War. But what I'd like to do is give each of you a couple minutes to provide any observations concerning the period that we have covered that you feel maybe we've overlooked or maybe you've thought of while we're proceeding. So, Timothy, I'll start with you because I think you're the person I've spoken to last.
Thank you. Just to provide some context about what I think is missed from here. When historians talk about Reconstruction, they generally talk about three primary areas: physical reconstruction, which is, the rebuilding and repairing of the physical structures and facilities that were destroyed during the Civil War.
Timothy, could you hold up for 1 second? Michelle, would you remove the visual and then let Tim be on screen? There we go. Thank you. Sorry, Tim. You're too good looking to put in the background there without us being able to see you.
Thank you.
Right.
So they talk about physical reconstruction and then political reconstruction, And then economic reconstruction, which really was creating a system that kept wealth in white hands and exploited Black labor. But I really think this is an incomplete way of looking at Reconstruction, or rather an incomplete way in which Reconstruction was implemented. The element that's missing, in my opinion, is human reconstruction. That was no element of Reconstruction, whether by culture or law, that attempted to rebuild what slavery had destroyed in people. You see, slavery destroyed a lot in white people and in Black people. So white people under slavery became honestly more immoral as a result of slavery. They became desensitized to torture and abuse and murder. A prime example of this is Thomas Jefferson, our third president. Thomas Jefferson had biracial children with Sally Hemings, and he enslaved his own biracial children at his nail-making plantation in Monticello. So it degraded the moral fiber of white people, but it also really degraded Black people. When you think about African cultures, norms, spirituality, art, expression, parenting skills, cognitive skills, slavery took all of that away. Thus, Reconstruction should have had some components that really took place, both legally and socially, to rebuild and reconstruct the humanity that slavery destroyed. The reason that we still have some of the same issues that we had during Reconstruction, which is the mistreatment of certain people by race, institutional racism, still segregation, economic disparity. The reason we still have those issues is because we have not gone through a process of human construction that is challenging the status quo of a white system based off white morality and purposefully and intentionally infusing the humanity back into Black people that was taken from them as a result of slavery.
Thank you. Lauren, do you have any observations you'd like to?
How can I follow that?
Well,
I do. I can say something, but
I knew you could do it.
But Tim, that should have been like the mic drop moment right there. Like, I can't follow that. But I'll try to piggyback a little bit off of culture, but also I think we overlooked a little part of economics as well. So in talking about reconstructing, one of the things I study is masculinity, and particularly Black masculinity during slavery. When we look at white masculinity in the 19th century, white men gauge their masculinity and their self-worth on the ability to protect their dependents and provide for them. During slavery, we see that Black men found alternative ways to protect their family, but a lot of this time this was through non-traditional ways, because they couldn't provide a wage, or they couldn't help if their babies were sold away for them or their wife was separated from them. So in trying to reconstruct the Black family during Reconstruction, unfortunately, because of the inability of banks to give loans to Black Americans or to uphold the pay that a lot of people earn, we see the system of sharecropping and tenant farming, not just going back to what Dr. Jones said earlier with peonage, right? Because if I was owed $50 for my work and my landowner only gave me 20, I could not go to a court and get that money, and thus I become in debtor's prison. And that's taking Black men out of the family, putting the double burden on Black women. Now we see Black Americans find ways to offset this through kinship and through churches and through different ways of trying to offset that. But I think in looking at sharecropping and tenant farming and not allowing African Americans to accumulate the wealth for the labor in which they produce, it not only leads to generational poverty, but we see the breakup of the family that we just don't see in the white community.
Thank you. Wayne, your turn.
Yes, I would like to recount a bit of my family history at this juncture as it relates to economic.
Before you do that, let me just tell you this. We started 5 minutes late, so don't feel we've got to get finished right at 7:30. Okay, I didn't want to cut yourself short. Sorry, go ahead.
Not a problem. Yes, I want to recount a bit of family history in terms of economic and family cohesion. Right around 1915, and I've been doing research on my family history, but right around 1915, my family was situated in Louisiana, in Northeast Louisiana, in East Carroll County, or rather parish, and they were working on a large plantation, the Jones plantation, and some stranger happened up in the back hills of that area. And he asked one of the family members, "Why are you still up here working?" They said, "Well, we're working for the master." And he said, "Master?" They said, "Yes." He said, "Don't you know you're free?" And they said, "What do you mean free?" They said, "Haven't you heard about the 13th Amendment?" They said, "No, we haven't heard anything." Now, this was 1915. So for 50 years, my family had been on a plantation in Louisiana. And as you know, Louisiana was exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. And when they discovered that they were free, this stranger gave them the history. Then they decided, we're going to leave in the morning, but we're going to leave in clans. It was a very large family. My paternal grandfather was one of 10 sons, and my paternal grandmother, she had 2 sisters, and she had older children. My father had not been born yet, and there were many others of the family. So they decided they were going to leave the next day very early, and they would leave by clans and catch the ferry going north because they were right at the Mississippi. And they decided that they would ride to the end of each ferry line and meet up at the end of the day. What they didn't realize is that each ferry line stopped at a different landing. So at the end of the day, they were all distributed at different landings, some on the east tributary of the Mississippi and some on the west tributary. Some landed in various places in Arkansas and some in Mississippi. And the family never regathered. So my family comes out of 50 years of post-Amendment 13 and Emancipation Proclamation that was never followed by the plantation owner. And now it is better than 100 years later, and there are still branches of my family that we have not connected with yet. I did find some of my family branches through searching. So when we talk about what has happened to the family and economically, we're talking about the fallout of family destruction, the loss of cohesion, and then the combined economic value of the families working together. So that's just one instance, and my story is not unique. So that's what I want to leave with in this discussion. And that's something that is very difficult, if ever, to be repaired.
Thank you. I appreciate it in that story. One quick question for you before we get to Ray,
Sure.
And that is, would you explain to the audience why the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Louisiana?
Well, yes, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to Louisiana because Louisiana was not part of the Confederacy. And so as a result, they were exempt.
Right. I mean, the proclamation said only for those territories in open rebellion. And
That's
Louisiana
correct.
was not. Okay. Thank you. Ray,
That's correct.
you want to pick it up?
I mean, following Dr. Jones intimidates me here. I don't have anything quite like that. it's a powerful and unfortunate story, but I'm sorry, I can't really follow that very well. But something Lauren said did strike me. There's a study, a really important study showing that if you compare Black and white boys who both make it to the middle class, the Black boy is far more likely to fall out of that and fall to the bottom. And one of the reasons is because of the absence of fathers. And that's in part explained by high rates of incarceration among black men. So I think the family structure issue is surprisingly important even to today. And there's so many forces working against the cohesion of the Black family, and we really have to address that. Just the only thing I wanted to mention were two other policies. Social Security Act made a point of excluding certain occupations that disproportionately employed people of color, so they were cut out of that. Later, the GI Bill, as I'm sure everybody on the call here knows, effectively, not legally, but effectively excluded people of color from starting businesses, buying homes, and going to college. And so that was another wealth building opportunity from which they were excluded. And then I would just finally say this work goes on. As I mentioned already, the tax code is already making the wealth gap worse. And we've done a lot of studies on college, which people think is the great equalizer. It turns out that the college itself is actually growing the racial wealth gap, not making it more narrow, because whites get such a higher return on their degrees, than Blacks do. So I think this work is ongoing, and it has to include public policy. Public policy has decided who gets to build wealth and who doesn't. And if it's been part of the problem, it has to be part of the solution going forward.
Thank you. I appreciate each one of you. Each of you had your own input in this. They're unique, special, and I'll tell you, if somebody was watching this program didn't learn something and get some impression as to some things that they were misconceived about our country up until now. And this isn't a criticism of our country. We live in a great country in the sense that we are free to have this discussion, and we're free to have the opportunity to try to make amends for that which has taken place. So this discussion is all about getting those facts that you've heard this evening and processing them. As you see, we got to World War II. We've got an awful lot left to go, so we're going to have another segment. And the next segment is going to try to get us from World War II through the year 2000. We'll keep trying at this, but we have such qualified individuals who can give us such insight. It's difficult for us to try to speed the train along. So I thank each of the panelists this evening. I'd like to invite the audience back. Again, we're going to do this in June. I believe the date's the 17th. Is that correct, Gerald? Okay, he's nodding his head.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, the 17th, we will reconvene this, and we'll try to do this again with reference to the time frame from the World War II through the present time. And we'll do that again without the intention of getting into exactly what reparations should be, shouldn't be, pro, con, but get the stories out there so we can process this. Again, thank you to each of our panelists. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, Gerald. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.